I am pleased to be opening this series of FLOS lectures that, as the name transparently states, are organized by the ERC Starting Grant Project FLOS, which means Florilegia Syriaca, as many or some of you know. And the subtitle of this project is The Intercultural Dissemination of Greek Christian Thought in Syriac and Arabic in the First Millennium CE. The project has been running for 3 years now, and as you have probably read on our poster, or you know from other sources, FLOS is studying the ways in which the numerous Syriac collections of patristic excerpts of the 8th to 10th centuries, that is what we call patristic Florilegia, functioned as organizers of knowledge for Syriac and Arabic-speaking Christians within the cultural landscape of the late Umayyad and early Abbasid era. So the selection and rearrangement of Greek patristic writings in the Florilegia had a deep impact on the development of Syriac and Christian Arabic literature and thought, on interdenominational relations within Syriac Christianity, and on the confrontations between Christian and Islamic intellectual cultures. So at the end of January 2020, we were so lucky as to be able to physically convene just at the last minute in Venice for our first workshop, which focused on Syriac anthologies and collections in particular. Now, this series of FLOS lectures, which is our second major event and necessarily takes place online, intends to broaden the scope and to tackle topics that are more widely at the center of our interests. Thus, there will be papers on the development of speculative theology in Eastern Christianity, on the composition and excerpting practices in diverse Eastern Christian contexts, and on the entangled intellectual histories of Greek, Syriac, and Arabic Christianities. So the speaker who is kicking us off today is Peter Tarras, who, after getting an MA in Near and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Munich, is currently a research assistant in the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft funded project Arabic and Latin Glossary. He also teaches at the University of Munich, where he is a PhD candidate and is writing a doctoral dissertation at the university, at the same university, so of Munich, under the supervision of Peter Adamson and Dag Hasse, on evil and free will in Al-Farabi. He's also an associated member of Biblia Arabica, always at the University of Munich. And despite his young age, academic age, Peter has already published extensively in the field of Christian Arabic studies. I should especially like to mention a long article published in 2019 on free will in Syriac and Christian Arabic sources, and a row of articles and notes on the Bible in Arabic and on the Bible as cited by Christian Arabic authors. Today, he will talk, as you see, on a related topic, freedom of the will or freedom of nature, a conceptual conundrum in Syriac and Christian Arabic sources. So Peter, please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Emiliano, for your very kind introduction. And let me also start by just thanking the organizers of this lecture series, first and foremost, Emiliano, but also Bishara Beit and also Emanuele Zimbardi, who will be responding to my paper, for giving me the opportunity to present my ideas today and for being here today. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I've prepared a presentation. So you should now all be able to see the presentation. And here's a brief table of contents of what I will be speaking about today. And I start with an introduction. Every scholarly discussion of the medieval Arabic debate over free will should be prefaced with a disclaimer, namely that there existed no such debate. At least the following two issues make it hard to uphold that it was actually free will that was debated. So here's the first one. The expression free will, irada khuriya, that will be the literal translation, does not pertain to the medieval Arabic theological or philosophical lexicon. This was already expressed very pointedly by Joseph van Es in a 29 article, where he said that there was no word for freedom in Arabic with respect to the intended sense, namely freedom of the will. Huria meant something completely different. Van Es relied on a little received monograph by Franz Rosenthal, which is now available also in a re-edition by Dimitri Gutas, where Rosenthal expressed already the same view. So Rosenthal wrote, for instance, that the Arabic term ikhtiyar, conventionally translated as free choice, was never seen together with huria, nor was it felt as one aspect of the complex structure of freedom. There's one notable exception to Rosenthal's and Van Es's otherwise correct observations. At least for some Christian authors writing in Arabic, huria did not mean something completely different. This, however, constituted an isolated choice of terminology that never succeeded on the stage of mainstream philosophical and theological literature in Arabic. This specific use of huria was confined to Christian authors, and notably to authors whose intellectual frame of reference was the Syriac theological tradition, which in fact debated human freedom from the 2nd century AD onwards, using the cognate Syriac term chirutha. Now, the Syriac term chirutha, just as the Arabic huria or the Greek eleuteria for that matter, all these terms are political terms originally, contrasting free persons with slaves. The semantically expanded use of huria, arguably translating as freedom of the will, which probably presupposed a similar semantic expansion of the Greek term eleuteria, is the direct ancestor of the Christian Arabic use of huria. This brings me to the second issue. In the minority of medieval Arabic texts that document this specific use of huria, it is not self-evident what is meant by huria. My paper is devoted to this second issue. My argument rests on the premise that if we encounter instances of the Arabic term huria and mutatis mutandis of the Syriac term chirutha that arguably translate as freedom of the will, this nevertheless does not imply that the author meant the exact same thing as we do when we speak about freedom of the will. Put differently, the terms huria and chirutha, as used in late ancient and medieval Syriac and medieval Christian Arabic texts, do not necessarily denote the exact same concept as the English expressions free will or freedom of the will. If we want to understand what Christian Arabic authors meant when they wrote about huria, we must turn to the Syriac tradition. As I wish to show in the following, in the earliest strata of the Syriac debate over human freedom, surprisingly, it is the concept nature, keyana, that we encounter as the starting point for the conceptual clarification of freedom. The debate about human freedom hence turns out to be in fact more about free nature than free will. Owing to this, freedom was not, or at least not generally, understood as a property of a psychic capacity or a psychic power called will or willing. Rather, we see freedom described as a power superior to the will, governing the will and guaranteeing volitional unity. The Christian Arabic use of huria echoes this understanding, or so I shall argue. Rosenthal also begins with a brief survey of the Syriac tradition and takes note of the close conceptual ties between chirutha on the one hand and keyana on the other, so freedom and nature. Yet he marginalizes this connection in order to focus on a different narrative according to which chirutha in the course of theological debate was not only reduced to some sort of abstract technicality, but semantically subordinated to will, seviana. According to Rosenthal, this bloodless image of freedom, as he calls it, is a forerunner of the allegedly meager understanding of human freedom of medieval Muslims. The philosophically important implication of this line of argument is that the theological debate had produced a notion of freedom as a property of the will. It is my aim here to show that this is not the case. The first part of the paper begins with a brief critique of this narrative, and I will then turn to the hero of Rosenthal's story, namely Ephraim the Syrian, whom he portrays as the harbinger of an ecstatic understanding of freedom that was unable to survive post-Ephraimian Syriac scholasticism. Contrasting Ephraim with what earlier authors had to say about the conceptual relationship between freedom and nature shows that it is actually Ephraim who could be said to advocate a diminished understanding of freedom. Turning to the Christian Arabic tradition, I will argue that this course of events nevertheless did not entirely determine the post-Ephraimian understanding of freedom in its relation to nature. Finally, I shall conclude with a few remarks on the way in which this analysis bears on a philosophically enriched understanding of the Christian Arabic use of the term Huria. Rosenthal starts his argument with the observation that early Arabic lists of philosophical terms do not contain a definition of freedom. His example is the well-known undefinitions ascribed to Al-Kindi, which in fact has to say a fair bit about human agency, will, and choice, but does not include the term Huria. Hence, according to Rosenthal, the oldest definition of freedom from the Islamic Near East does not come from Muslim circles and was not expressed in Arabic. Rather, it is a similar Syriac memra on definitions ascribed to Michael Badoka, but compiled by an anonymous author that provides him with this oldest definition. In the memra on definitions, Cherutha, freedom, is defined as the unconstrained dominion of the rational natures, Meshaltutha la ketirata de Chiane Melile. According to Rosenthal, a rather poorly expressed result of centuries of Syriac theological thought. Relying on Giuseppe Furlani, he identifies the 6th century, possibly East Syrian bishop Ahudemech as the source of this definition of freedom, without, however, noticing that Ahudemech's psychological, essentially Stoic definition of freedom that understands freedom as the dominion of the will over the non-rational parts of the soul is much more specific than the one in the memra on definitions. Still, Rosenthal thinks that in both texts or both authors, freedom has become a servant of the will. He reaches this conclusion by way of comparison to Ephraim the Syrian, who, in his eyes, offers an ecstatic description of freedom as the essence of being created in the image of God. This estimation primarily relies on Ephraim's poetic works. After Ephraim, the notion of freedom encapsulating human godlikeness supposedly faded into the background, such that freedom was subordinated conceptually to will. Following this narrative, the concept of freedom witnessed its own fall of sorts while the Syriac tradition unfolded, the Syriac theological tradition. A bloodless image was all that remained of the original notion of all-embracing power and glory. I think that this narrative is not tenable. At least 2 issues call for correction. The first concerns the conceptual hierarchy of freedom and will, and the second concerns the concept dominion, a constitutive conceptual element of both Ahudemech's and the memra on definitions definition of freedom that Rosenthal fails to take into account. As for the first issue, it may suffice to give a clear example of the conceptual irreducibility of freedom and will, or of freedom to will, which comes from Theodor Baconi's Book of Scholia, written some 400 years after Ephraim, and which actually engages the question whether the will precedes freedom or vice versa.
Sorry, Peter, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I'm very sorry, but perhaps you are going on with your presentation. But we only see the first page, the title page.
I'm sorry. So I was changing to full screen. Can you now see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. I'm very sorry for that.
No, sorry to interrupt you, but I thought you were already using some
Yeah, I
slides.
was actually.
Okay.
So we are here now.
Okay.
I leave it just that way so that you all can follow.
Perfect. Sorry.
Now, Theodor, in his book of Scholia, has to say the following on this question whether the will precedes freedom or vice versa. He writes, the will comes after freedom. If this would not be so, freedom would be forced to act through the will. It is, however, only one thing, that that the will is able to do by itself, and necessarily all of us either become sinners or righteous. Thus there would neither be reward nor punishment, and we would not receive punishment in accordance with our actions, for it would not be up to our freedom to sin or to become righteous. Theodore makes clear that freedom must be prior to the exercise of the will. Freedom is in fact independent from particular acts of will. Otherwise, we would not be free as long as we do not will this or that. The most important point, however, is that he describes the will in terms of uniformity. It can only do one thing. It must be noted that Theodore, like other authors before him, does not distinguish between the will and an act of willing. Both is called seviana. Hence, he also denies that there could be two wills, trin seviane. Otherwise, we would have to possess a potentially endless number of wills in order to explain how we can will a potentially endless number of things. A multiplicity of objects of willing must not imply a multiplicity of wills. The default scenario is, of course, the one in which we have to decide between good and evil. As we shall see, Ephraim thinks that the concept will does not suffice to explain how human beings deal with this scenario. And so does Theodore. We have to explain how one will that is directed at one object at a time can nevertheless change its direction. This is exactly the function of freedom. It is also for this reason that freedom, and not the will, epitomizes moral responsibility. Theodore clearly conceptualizes freedom as a power higher than the will. His response makes clear that freedom of the will rests on a much more intricate relationship than one between subject and attribute. As for the second point, Rosenthal does not notice that the common element of Achudemech's and the Memron definition's definition of freedom is the concept dominion, in Syriac meshaltutha or shultana. This way, he also fails to see that it is actually dominion and not freedom that encapsulates the idea of human godlikeness. To be fair, Achudemech's notion, shultana, and later compounds, like for example, meshaltuth beyatha, very likely echo the Greek technical term autoxousion, literally self-dominion, that the Stoics employed to denote human autonomy, and that was largely adopted by patristic authors from Justin Martyr onwards. On the other hand, terms like shultana resonated lexically with the creation account of Genesis, a parallel that Syriac authors did not fail to exploit. The Peshitta expresses the dominium terrae by means of the root shin lamet tau, from which are also formed the Syriac technical terms for dominion. As we shall see already in Ephraim, Cherutha and Meshaltutha are used as synonyms. The stark contrast Rosenthal construes between Ephraim and later authors thus cannot be upheld. The close association of freedom and human godlikeness does not disappear from the later tradition and rather prominently figures in commentaries on the 6 days of creation, so-called hexamera, as well as treatises on God's providence. Dominion, the connecting link between two notions of freedom and godlikeness, continues to serve as the most important explicans of freedom. In sum, what Rosenthal identifies as a bloodless image of the freedom that Ephraim used to depict in glowing colors is actually a rather specific psychological notion of freedom as independence from inner constraint. Post-Ephraimian writers incorporated this understanding, but were not exclusively beholden to it. They preserved a clear grasp of the conceptual hierarchy of freedom and will. They also preserved the biblically grounded understanding that freedom is essentially a form of dominion. Now, if we take a step back and look at what Syrian thinkers had to say about freedom before Ephraim, we will see that he himself already employs what could be called a restricted understanding of freedom. Yet this is not the point I want to make. I'm interested in the fact that our sources display both semantically enriched and semantically impoverished versions of the concept freedom. And I'm particularly interested in the reasons behind these semantic dialectics. In the end, I think that this demonstrates that the Syriac term Cherutha and its Arabic equivalent Huria signify broader concepts of freedom than our English expression freedom of the will. I will approach these questions by way of contextualizing Ephraim's understanding of freedom. This contextualization rests on a contrast I want to highlight between Ephraim's first letter to Hypatius, in my view, certainly his most argumentative text on the topic, and the Syriac book of the laws of the countries, henceforth BLC, a text that stands at the beginning not only of the Syriac debate over human freedom, but of Syriac theological literature as a whole. This text is deemed one of the most important sources for the thought of the 2nd, 3rd century Christian philosopher Badaison of Edessa. It was not authored by Badaison, but styles him in the role of Socrates in a sort of Platonic dialogue with 2 of his students. I'm not interested in questions of authenticity or authorship here, but will simply view the text as one of the earliest documents of the Syriac debate over freedom. Though Ephraim was to become one of the fiercest vilifiers of Badaison, his ideas on freedom are indebted to Badaison, or so I shall argue. Both derive from the way in which they conceptualize the relationship between freedom and nature, a contrast between uniform and multiform agency. In Badaison, this contrast, however, is a gradual one, whereas in Ephraim, it is a categorical one. Ephraim advocates a rigid dichotomy of freedom and nature. Badaison does not. It is in this sense that Ephraim might be viewed as having an impoverished understanding of freedom. The earlier, arguably enriched Badaisonian understanding, however, remained available, as the Christian Arabic tradition can demonstrate. In the BLC, the Book of the Laws of the Countries, creation divides into the realms of nature, fate, and freedom. To the realm of nature pertain all non-rational entities, including even natural forces. To the realm of fate pertain astral forces, possibly spiritual beings associated with the stars that Badaison calls governors, shalitane, and guides, medabrane. To the realm of freedom pertain angels and human beings. Thus, at first sight, freedom and nature appear to sit on opposite sides of neat ontological and conceptual boundaries. The tripartite cosmology is mirrored in a tripartite anthropology. The human body is part of the realm of nature. The soul is part of the realm of fate, since the constellations of the stars determine the descent of intellects into souls. The intellect is part of the realm of freedom. However, if we have a closer look at the way in which Badaison speaks about freedom, our neat boundaries become loose. In a central passage in the BLC, he says, "Because human beings are created in the image of God, therefore it is given unto them to lead their lives according to their own will, and to do all that they are able to do if they will, or not to do it if they will not, justifying themselves or becoming guilty. For if they were so created that they could not do evil, so that they could not incur guilt, then in that way the good they did would not be their own either. It will be clear to you, therefore, that God's goodness to human beings is great in giving them more freedom than to all the elemental beings we have spoken of." Already here, freedom is understood as godlikeness. Badaison closely ties freedom to the operations of the will. Thus it seems as though freedom simply means free will. However, the comparative construction yatir men, more than, should give us pause. The comparanda are human beings and elemental beings, in Syriac estorse. The former, human beings, have more freedom than the latter. This means, however, that those so-called elemental beings do possess some degree of freedom. In fact, Badaison even holds that they will receive judgment at the end of days in accordance with that over which they have dominion, behai damshaltin. The Greek kalk estorse is Badaison's term for certain compounds of basic elements that he calls ethie, literally existence. These ethie are the primary building blocks of creation, and later authors, first and foremost Ephraim, seem to have understood Badaison as holding that they are some kind of pre-eternal matter. The BLC remains silent on that point. Badaison only says that God gave them order. This bestowal of order upon the ethie, however, leads to a partial loss of their original power. This disempowerment was necessary to render ineffective the ethie's harmful operations. Bardaisan draws on two related notions to characterize the consequences of this primordial loss of power. The first is the notion of God's command, Pukdana. The elemental beings are bound, kebirin, or even fettered, asirin, by God's command. However, for Bardaisan, the fact that the elemental beings are bound in their activity does not mean that they are completely deprived of all freedom. They are deprived of a great share of it, though, and this is expressed by the second notion involved here. The elemental beings are instruments, mane, which for Bardaisan means above all that they can follow only one uniform course of action. This uniformity is what constitutes their nature. In general, uniformity is what characterizes nature. Bardaisan makes reference to this idea in the passage I quoted. If human beings were able to do good alone, they would perform one sort of act only, which means that they would act in the way of instruments, that is, uniformly. The multiformity of human action thus is what raises humans above the realm of nature. Contrary to our contemporary sentiment, for Bardaisan, nature embodies not an original state, but rather a loss thereof. The original state is preserved only in those beings that possess freedom to the full extent. And this full-blown freedom is marked terminologically by the expression freedom of one's own, cherutha de nafsha. Yet Bardaisan can compare the freedom of their own of humans and angels to the restricted or restrained uniform activity of elemental beings and nature in general, because he understands freedom as a gradual concept. As we shall now see, in Ephraim, freedom cannot serve as this tertium comparationis. In his first letter to Hypatius, Ephraim employs a number of labored metaphors that are meant to reinforce the idea that human freedom is something wondrous, almost incomprehensible. His musings climax in the following passage. This is a wonder, dumara, that although the will is one to taste, tartin ta'aman, which are not uniform, are found in its uniformity, bishau yuthe. And I know that what I have said is so, but why it is so, I am not able to demonstrate. For I wonder how that one thing, chathmedem, enslaves and is enslaved by itself. But know that if this was not so, human beings would have no freedom. For if compulsion, ketira, makes us will, we have no freedom. And if again our will is bound and unable to will and not to will, we have no dominion, meshaltutha. As in Bardaisan, freedom positively denotes the capacity to will and not will. Negatively, it denotes the absence of compulsion. Both is called dominion, meshaltutha. Still, the bidirectionality of willing and not willing remains a wonder. Actually, Ephraim describes the will in much the same terms as Theodore Baconi after him. It is one thing, chathmedem, and characterized by uniformity, shauyutha. At the same time, this uniformity falls into multiplicity. Ephraim here almost seems to see the danger of a splitting up of the will. Each act of will inhibits a counteract of will, which means that the will is at the same time the subject and object of an inner compulsion. Ephraim writes, for in a single day there are produced in us a great number of wills which destroy each other. He has no interest at all to solve this paradox, and I have already mentioned that the clear hierarchy of freedom and will in Theodore Baconi might be understood as an attempt at doing so. Ephraim at least provides some clues as to this solution. The will forms a unity even though its operations seem to undo it into a multiplicity. The stability of this unity is what Ephraim calls dominion, which is identical with freedom. Since dominion or freedom, however, also includes the negative criterion of the absence of compulsion, the concept freedom must be more extensive than the concept will. The negative criterion preconditions the positive bidirectionality of the will. This certainly anticipates Theodore's hierarchy. At the same time, the negative criterion reinforces the paradoxical state of affairs. Ephraim insists that what he cannot explain is the inward compulsion, as he says, ketira de men legau, that is involved in every single act of will. In fact, this allegedly inexplicable notion, however, serves a very clear purpose. In fact, so if we are basically continuously under an inner compulsion, there's effectively no room for being under the compulsion of nature. Otherwise, we would end up with basically two explanations for one and the same thing. According to Ephraim, all our actions are determined, but they are not determined by nature. They are determined by the operations of the will, which are at the very same time free and compelled. We see that it is no coincidence that Ephraim characterizes the will as uniform. In this, it not only parallels nature, but is fit to take the place of nature when it comes to explaining human agency. At the same time, the will exhibits a broken uniformity, which makes necessary a sort of superior capacity. Thus, freedom becomes a guarantor of unbroken volitional unity, but also something of a mystery. Freedom means at once compulsion and the absence of compulsion, which is a forcibly incomprehensible notion. It is meant to exclude at all costs that nature has anything to do with how we act, even if this implies that freedom, as it were, absorbs nature or its essential features. This effectively inverts Bardyson's idea that there is potentially freedom in nature. Turning now to the Christian Arabic tradition, we will see how the specific Christian Arabic use of the term Hurriya seems to rehabilitate the original Bardysonian notion. I'm familiar with only 3 Christian Arabic authors who employ the term Hurriya as an equivalent to the Syriac Cherutha. In the late 8th and early 9th century AD, we find it in the writings of the Melkite author Theodore Abu Qurra and the East Syrian author Ammar el-Basri. It reappears in another East Syrian writer in the 11th century, Abu al-Faraj Abdallah ibn Tayyib. In these 3 authors, the concept freedom is closely linked to the concept nature. Having now seen how the debate over freedom started and evolved in the Syriac tradition, this comes as no surprise. Other Christian Arabic authors have preserved the idea that human choice and willing are, in a way, conceptually related to nature, but they do not resort to the term Hurriya. In the course of future research, there might surface more texts and authors, but I think that the term Hurriya will remain a rare term. I will here focus on the first named author, Theodore Abu Qurra, who devoted a whole treatise to the topic and uses Hurriya as the standard way of referring to human freedom. Abu Qurra's definition of freedom already gives him away as an author highly indebted to the Syriac theological tradition, with which he was undoubtedly acquainted, being, like Bardyson, a native of Edessa. In his treatise on freedom, Theodore writes, "Thus it is that freedom is called freedom, being that it always has dominion over itself, musallita ala nafsiha, to incline wherever it wants through its own will, bi iradatiha. This is its dominion, sultanuha, which does not cease and is not in any way subject to compulsion, al-qahr. Without doubt, its dominion is operative in its intention, fi niyatiha." As in the Syriac definitions of freedom, the concept dominion, in Arabic it is musallit, sultan, is placed at the center and also accords lexically with its Syriac models. We find here also the same hierarchic relationship between freedom and the will that we are already familiar with from Theodor Bocconi. In a semi-allegorizing manner, Abu Qurra speaks of freedom's own will. This means that he equally understands freedom as superior to the will. However, there is also an important difference to Theodor Bocconi. In Abu Qurra, freedom does not seem to be necessary as a solution to the problem of the will's unity. Instead, we come across the notion of intention, niyya, that now serves to explain how it is that the will can be steered in different directions. Our intentions, not our actions, are what makes us morally responsible. Thus, Sidney Griffith rightly called the notion of intention the very epicenter of Abu Qurra's anthropology of freedom. Now, according to Abu Qurra, the central concern of his text is that we establish that there is freedom in human nature. In contrast to Bardyson, Abu Qurra does not provide a cosmogonic account. In general, he does not say a terrible lot about the nature of human beings on freedom. He connects freedom to human godlikeness and says that God gave it as a gift, jada, and arranged it in the nature of human beings, rattaba fi khilkatihi. He touches upon this subject in some of his other writings. For instance, based on the likeness relationship on the existence of the creator, he devises an epistemological method that uses the attributes of human nature as a way to rationally comprehend God's attributes. Both freedom and virtue set us in a relation to God. Adam's fall is not due to a defect, a nox in his nature, which would mean that there is also a defect in God, but to the laxity of his freedom, istirha huriyatihi. This laxity also provides Satan with a target. In his text on the death of Christ, Abu Qurra even puts in the mouth of Satan the words, "I have subdued the likeness of God, and for that reason the whole creation cringes before me. Inni stabattu surat Allah wa dhallat li khaliqa kulluha fi sababbiha." This again presupposes an understanding of freedom as dominion in accordance with the biblical dominium terrae. Abu Qurra emphasizes that it is not our nature that makes us sin, but rather that we do not live up to our nature if we sin. As in Bardaisan, the departure from original nature implies a loss of freedom. Hence, it becomes clear that Abu Qurra understands nature as the abode or substrate of freedom. This way, he rehabilitates the Bardaisanian notion of freedom, but cleanses it of its cosmological superstructure. I want to come back now to the conceptual conundrum with which I started. I argued that it is hard to speak of a medieval Arabic debate over free will, amongst whose participants we would certainly have to count Theodor Abu Qurra, since first, there was not available a good Arabic equivalent to the English expression free will, and second, the best candidate for such an equivalent, the Arabic term hurriya, does not exactly correspond to what we would understand by free will or freedom of the will. We have now seen in what way it does not correspond. The first important point is that Syriac and Christian Arabic authors did not understand freedom as a property of the will. Ahudemech's psychological understanding of freedom as the will's dominion over the non-rational parts of the soul comes closest to this idea. Rosenthal would have us believe that this understanding dominated the post-Ephraimian theological debate. Both Theodor Baconi and Theodor Abu Qurra are striking examples that it did not. For them, freedom is a power superior to the will. It must be superior in order to deal with the problem of the will's unity, a problem that seems to have been solved by Ephraim. Abu Qurra answers it in a different way, but preserves the hierarchic structure of freedom and the will. The second important point is that all the authors I discussed have the inherently Christian understanding of freedom as in some way or another related to the biblical injunction that human beings were to rule over creation. This is the central conceptual element of dominion in all the definitions of Cherutha and Hurriya, which I have discussed. Freedom is a reflection of human godlikeness, but it is dominion that connects freedom and godlikeness conceptually. The third and probably most important point is that our authors, with the exception of Ephraim the Syrian, understand freedom as something inherent in nature. This idea is found in its most radical form in the BLC, where it even implies that the whole of creation will undergo final judgment. We have seen that Ephraim inverts this idea of potentially free nature in order to strictly separate the realms of freedom and nature. In Ephraim, though, freedom assumes an essential quality of nature, namely that of compulsion, thus leaving no room for natural compulsion within the human being. Theodor Abu Qurra, by contrast, resorts to the originally Bardaisanian idea to achieve effectively the same thing. If freedom is inherent in our nature, there is no need to fear that we could be compelled by that which pertains to nature. Now, the conclusion of my argument is not that it would not be completely that it would be completely anachronistic to speak of a medieval Arabic free will debate or a Syriac free will debate for that matter. Of course, the expression free will debate has its origin in Western history and historiography of philosophy. This does not prohibit per se the extension of its use to non-Western contexts. When saying that there existed no medieval Arabic free will debate, my intention is rather to stress the dissimilarities of both contexts in order to allow for an appreciation of the intricacies of native concepts and terminology. This is what I hope my argument achieved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this rich and largely overarching lecture. Was among the many merits, the merit to create a long diachronic, to put the problem of free will in a long diachronic perspective, an interlinguistic perspective. And I'm sure, because of the richness of this diachronic perspective, among other things, there will be questions on it. But first, we have to give the floor to our discussant, Emanuele Zimbardi, who is a member of the FLOS team, who has especially worked on Ephraim the Syrian and recently got a joint PhD from the Sapienza University of Rome and the Freie Universität of Berlin. He's currently preparing in the FLOS project, within the frame of the FLOS project, a critical edition with English translation and commentary of Anthony of Tagrid's Treatise on God's Good Providence. So please, Emanuele.
So thank you. First of all, many thanks to Peter Tarras for this rich paper, which gives us plenty of opportunities to reflect upon the diverging notions of free will and nature in ancient Christianity as a whole. I do agree with you in challenging Rosenthal's restricting understanding of freedom as a subordinate of will, that according to him, Eastern Christianity inherited from Ephraim's thought. As you rightly demonstrate, Rosenthal's view does not take into account the different nuances of the concepts of freedom and will, and above all, the dialectic with the concept of nature. In fact, this dialectic is at the core of the first Syriac reflections on the topic, as you explain in your accounts on the Book of the Laws of Countries and on the first letter to Hypatius by Ephraim. So to open the discussion, I would like to raise 4 questions that may be useful for a wider understanding of the topic of your talk. So first, about the existence or not of a debate on the issue of free will. At the beginning of your paper, you argued that such a debate did not exist in the Arabic world, at least not as we conceive of it in the Western context. However, your paper brilliantly demonstrates that at least Christian authors writing in Arabic did inherit the conceptualization and the problematization of human free will from previous discussions in Syriac Christianity. And as you pointed out, these discussions happened within a broader framework, that of anthropology, in the sense of the understanding of the human position in creation according to God's providence. So I would ask you whether it would be possible to suppose also for Islamic philosophy at least a debate about free will, which was incorporated into a wider discussion about God's providence and the faculties which God bestowed to man at the moment of creation. Then my second question is about the polemical background of Bardaizan's and Ephraim's discussions. As scholars have pointed out, their ideas on human nature and free will were also triggered by the opposition against the dualistic anthropological systems of the Marcionites and of the Manichaeans. Also, the Greek fathers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries engaged in polemic against these two heresies while defining the role of human free will and demonstrating that the possibility of doing evil or doing good is ultimately a faculty of human freedom as established by God. I wonder if in the Christian Arabic thinking, there are some echoes of this earlier polemical engagement of late antique fathers, and if so, to what extent they made use of the anti-heretical rhetoric and possibly applied it to their contemporary religious historical setting. Then a third point to take into account is the influence of Aristotle on Islamic and on Christian Arabic thought. I especially have in mind the Mu'tazilite movement. For example, Abu al-Hudayl discusses the human capacity of action in terms of the two moments of power and action, taking into account these two Aristotelian concepts and declining them into a theological and anthropological reflection. Another example is the definition of the human being having a rational nature with an autonomous decisional faculty, and thus standing above the determinism of nature, which is presented by Aristotle, for example, in the De Partibus Animalium. So I would ask whether Arabic Christian writers could be as well influenced by Aristotelian thinking, either for a direct philosophical knowledge or through the medium of the Mu'tazila. The latter possibility would be meaningful to connect the Christian-Arabic debate on free will to Islamic theology. And my final and fourth point is a suggestion for further reflection on the relation between will, power, and action in the definition of freedom. I am thinking of something that may be not immediately evident in the ancient Syriac definitions of Hirutho that you mentioned in your paper. For example, the definition of free will that Anthony of Tancred provides in his first discourse on providence is this: the fact that we might by ourselves accomplish whatsoever we want, the things which come in our power, either the evil or the good ones. In this definition, Anthony implies that a man cannot actually perform anything that his will wants, but among them only the ones which he is able to. And also Bardaisan says in his definition of human freedom, to do all that they are able to do. So the limited power of man is obviously a constraint to human action, but not to human thinking and human will. Now, I have not yet developed a systematic argument, but I was wondering if a similar notion of limiting and limited power, which as I said is central in Abu al-Hudayl, for example, could be found also in other Christian sources in a dialectical conceptualization of freedom involving power and action. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Emanuele, for these very thought-provoking questions that you raised, and I will try to answer them in the order that you also presented them. So the first concerned the question regarding an existence of a free will debate in the context of medieval Arabic philosophy or even medieval Islamic philosophy. And so first of all, I just wanted to clarify that my somewhat polemical statements and my somewhat polemical introduction is basically a meta reflection on historiography. So often we approach these texts and simply put labels on them like free will, freedom of the will, and so forth, that immediately suggest a connection to contexts, to Western contexts that we are much more familiar with, say Augustine or the whole medieval Latin debate over free will. And I think that this is historically or historiographically problematic in that it somehow mutes all these fine-grained aspects that I was trying to highlight in my talk. So that was basically the motivation behind this somewhat polemical rhetoric that I used. But then, of course, I actually don't think that it is impossible to speak of a free will debate when it comes to medieval Arabic or Islamic philosophy. And I mean, a number of scholars have of course worked on that, but they work on these topics with a certain presupposition, namely that the terms at the center of these debates, for example, irada or ikhtiyar, so will, choice, but also like power, kudra, things like that, that they somehow translate as free will, or somehow have these adjective free attached to them. And that is, I think, really just an assumption. So this semantic aspect of freedom does not really play a huge role. It's rather about the things that you already highlighted. It is about capacity, about being able to do things. It is about action, how we have to conceive of action, how we have to conceive of the workings of the will, and how these different concepts interrelate. So how is choice related to the concept will? How is the concept will related to the concept action, and so forth? I think maybe what one could take away from that is that if we deal with such topics, we should probably really focus on these conceptual relationships and not so much on how these people try to express freedom. That was not so much their concern. I mean, their concern was, of course, to counter opposing positions of determinism, and there are also clear terms to describe different forms of determinism. Kacher, for example, one term that I quoted. But it is very interesting if we also look at the fact that, for example, an author like Theodor Abukura can contrast huria, this term freedom, with a term like kacher, compulsion. We would not find that in Muslim authors. So they also have this term kacher, but they would contrast it with different notions, with the notion of irada, with the notion of ikhtiyar, and so forth. So I think here's really something going on that is particular to this Christian Arabic tradition, and that is basically what I wanted to highlight. Now, as for the second question, the polemical background, this is of course of a very huge importance, and I mean, I left this context out in order to really focus on the conceptual relationships, but actually historically I think that this was really the driving force. So already Bardaisan arguably is answering to Marcionite claims, as Han Drivers shows, but also Ephraim's first letter to Hypatios is clearly styled as an anti-dualistic polemic, and also the biblical similes that he uses and the way that they are interpreted, or rather the kind of interpretation that he wants to counter, they clearly point at a Manichaeistic background for his opponents, basically. I mean, in the text itself, his opponents are only called heresies, but it seems fairly certain that he's arguing against Manichaeans, or possibly Bardaisanites, who, as also Drivers suggested, might have reached at that time some similar conclusions to that of the Manichaeans. And it is, of course, due to their anthropology that Christian authors like Bardaisan, like Ephraim, also like Augustine in the Latin West, like Nemesius in the Greek tradition, and a great number of authors saw the need to really formulate very clearly their ideas on human freedom in order to contrast it with these dualistic and also deterministic ideas about human freedom. So I think historically these polemics are really the driving force behind the whole debate. And this, of course, continues in a different way, in a different garb, maybe in Islamic times. So also Theodor Abukura's text is a polemical text written against the Manichaeans, but I mean, as some authors have tried to show, it's certainly not just the Manichaeans that he is trying to combat there. And it's very likely that he has also in mind certain Muslim theologians who also have ideas about the relationship of God's power and human power that can be interpreted as a form of determinism. And I think that a third group maybe that one might think is addressed here are maybe Christians that saw some kind of or that felt some kind of attraction to these more or less deterministic conceptions. I think this comes out much clearer even in later authors who engage with similar questions, that their audience is not primarily a Muslim audience, but a Christian audience that is very familiar with the Muslim theological debate and also attracted to certain notions of this debate. Now, I think your third question is partly related to this fact. There is, of course, a very intimate relation between the Mu'tazila or Muslim kalam, Muslim speculative theology in general, and the non-Muslim theological movements of the time, the Christian Arabic theological movement, as well as the Judeo-Arabic theological movements. Both groups incorporate ideas from the Muslim theological debate, not only the concepts like irada, ikhtiyar, and so forth that are commonly used by Muslims, but also the different clusters of arguments and different clusters of issues that are debated. And of course, Aristotelian philosophy had an important influence on how these debates developed. So you asked whether one could also detect Aristotelian influence in Christian Arabic authors. I think Theodor Abukura might again serve as an example. Right at the beginning of his tract, he basically makes a distinction that reminds one of Aristotle's discussion of involuntariness at the beginning in the third chapter of his Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle basically says that we can only be said to act involuntarily if we act out of compulsion or out of ignorance. And Theodor uses these two concepts and basically wants to say that in the case of our sinning, so if we sin or if we do evil, we are so neither of the two categories hold. We are not under compulsion, and we are not ignorant. We can only pretend to be ignorant because basically our desires are stronger, and they make us sin. But actually, if we look at that case, we do not sin ignorantly, and we do not sin under compulsion. So that would be one example. I think another very fascinating example is also a commentary on the 6 days of creation, which is by a Jewish author, Al-Muqammas, who was, however, for some time a Christian, so he converted back and forth to Judaism, and whose teacher was probably Nonnas of Nisibis. And so we have a fragment edited by Sarah Strumser of his 6 Days of Creation commentary, which explicitly says, I think, that it is modeled on a Syriac Vorlage, and there in this fragment, Al-Muqammas basically develops a hierarchy of agents that are characterized by different forms of action. and their forms of actions is actually what makes up this hierarchical structure. And he begins with very basic forms of actions like that of fire and ice. Fire can only burn, ice can only produce cold. And this is clearly an example that comes from Aristotelian physics and was, of course, already earlier incorporated in these 6 days of creation commentaries, but Al-Muqannas takes this up here. So this is also, I think, a very fascinating example for this influence of Aristotelian philosophy. Now, as to your last question concerning the relationship of will, power, and action, so whether we find these ideas of ability, of limited power and limiting power as well. Maybe the one term that would express this most clearly in Arabic is istita', so literally ability, which has as its root actually the notion obedience. So that's very interesting. So our ability to will something or to do something is somehow related to obedience. This is very interesting, and this is of course also a term used by Christian Arabic authors. So for example, this East Syrian author that I named, Ammar al-Basri, he even has compounds like Khuriyat al-Istita'a or something like that, or Istita'at al-Khuriya. I think Theodor Abukura also uses a term like that. So for them, it's also clear that, of course, human beings cannot do everything that they want. Something that Aristotle, for example, would express by the notion boulesis. So we can only want what is really achievable for us, what lies within our power, what lies within our ability. But at the same time, within the realm of intellect, within the realm of thinking and so forth, we have a somewhat unlimited power. And this is, of course, also important for Christian anthropology. So it's not always what we do outwardly, which makes us sinners or not sinners, but it's also very important what we do within ourselves, what we think. There's a text that is closely related to Theodor Abukura, the so-called Summa Theologiae Arabica, about which Sidney Griffith published a lot. And in that text, we also find this discussion about human freedom. But one of the terms that stands at the center is not Huriya, but actually, I think it's Damir, like inner thought, the kind of inner decision or inner thought that moves us and that moves us to action. So I hope that this answered your questions and also added, again, some perspective to that.
Yes, absolutely. Many thanks for this rich answer. So it's really fascinating to think how deep were actually the philosophical ties with Christian Arabic thought, not only with Syriac tradition itself, but also so in relation with other traditional thinking. And I think that it would be a good way also to investigate on them in order to have a wider framework to work within. So many thanks.
Thank you both for this discussion, and I would also open up the floor to further questions from the audience. Okay, we have one from Matteo Poiani. Please, Matteo.
Thank you very much, Herr Tarras, for this insightful talk. Indeed, I don't know so much about the Christian Arabic relation and Syriac one, but I remember an article by Paolo Bettiolo in 2001, in which he discusses an article of the Mahé and the relation between Afrat and the Talmud. And in this article, the focus was on the word Jerusa. So it fits to our discussion, I think, because in this paper, and also Nahe wrote it, Jerusa, it is viewed as a freedom, but a virginal freedom, a freedom which is linked to the first Adam, but while Adam had children, the perfect Adam, which is free, that's Christ, has has not children, and so this idea of the liberty as of Jerusa as a virginal freedom, do you think it continues in the late Syriac tradition, 8th, 9th century? Thank you.
So first of all, thank you for this question. I'm also familiar with this article by Shlomo Nae, which is, I think, a fascinating piece of research that shows the wide semantic range of this Syriac term Jerutha. So Jerutha is not only this political notion of political freedom, and it is not only this notion of freedom of the will, or something that is connected to this idea of freedom of the will, but it is also, as you stressed, a notion that is connected to virginity, to celibacy, and yeah, was commonly understood by ascetic writers in exactly that sense. So, for example, the text by Afrahat that you pointed to has this rather ascetic understanding of Jerutha, and Nae basically uses these Syriac sources in order to highlight a very peculiar story that is told in the Babylonian Talmud. And I think so there reappears also the Aramaic term Jerutha, but I think he says that it's even a kind of hapax legomenon within the Talmud, so it's a very strange concept there, actually. But what I found really interesting is that this different understanding of Jerutha that Nae highlights in a way connects to what I was discussing, especially when it comes to the relationship between freedom and nature. So these ascetic authors that stress this virginal freedom, they also make clear that this has to do with an overcoming of nature. So in Afrahat also it is related to original nature. So basically, this non-original nature is what distracts us from our original freedom, and basically we have to come back to this original nature, or we do come back to this original nature if we exert our freedom, if we really make use of our freedom and make use of this virginal kind of freedom, that is this abstinence from sexual intercourse, since of course in this was seen the most powerful culmination of desires, of course. And yeah, but I think that there is a relationship if you ask me whether this understanding of Geruther continues also in later authors, I must say that I'm really not an expert on this Satic literature. I'm pretty sure it does, but I couldn't name your text where you would find it.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Matteo. We have a question from Giovanni Mandolino.
Thank you very much for your discussion. I have just one little question out of curiosity, because I am no expert in this field and on this particular topic. So my question is, do we have, as some of these authors that you mentioned, also a discussion of the relationship between nature and will applied to the nature and will of God? This might be particularly interesting in order to understand how they conceive, for example, man, the image of God. Does it involve also the relationship between nature and will? Since this seems to be the scriptural key linking the notion of free will or freedom with the deity. And also, I ask this because I happened to read an old paper by Richard Frank, who suggested, since Emanuele Zimbabwe mentioned Abul Hudayl, the Mu'tazili theologian, this paper by Richard Frank suggested that among the sources of Abul Hudayl's discussion were some questiones ad Grecos, questiones Christiane ad Grecos, which were concerned precisely with the topic of nature and will and their mutual relationship, but applied to God, not just to human will and nature. I know this is more curiosity than a question, but perhaps there is some further link that could be found. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. It's not really easy to answer this question. I mean, we have seen that these authors clearly link human freedom to God's nature and also human nature to God's nature. So freedom is really something that sets both in relation. However, the problem is, of course, how we are to understand nature here. And nature can, of course, have different meanings. One important meaning would be the one that just denotes all natural beings, natural processes, and so forth. When these authors speak of human nature, they sometimes mean that. So the natural processes like nutrition and so forth. But at the other hand, human nature or nature in general can also signify something like the essence of a thing. And I think when it comes to freedom, they rather mean this second type of nature. So if there's a relationship between God's nature and human nature, it is with respect to this second understanding of nature as the essence of God and the essence of the human being. But I think, for example, Theodor Abokura does not make a very clear distinction between these two realms. So both could be called tabi'a. So for example, for him, the compound between the body and the soul in the human being is tabi'a wahida, so it's the one nature. And Ephraim also would say that there is something that connects us to the nature of God, but the nature of God in itself is is basically incomprehensible. So there are no means to really rationally comprehend God's nature. Yeah, the relationship between nature and freedom, or nature and will, in God is nothing they really say a lot about. We can only more or less guess at that they somehow connect freedom to the nature of God, or freedom is something inherent or essentially pertaining to God. And God is, of course, also a volitional agent. So God has a will. God has created the world by his will. But there's really nothing more that they say on this relationship.
Thank you. Any further questions? You can also write them in the chat, of course.
I have a question, Emiliano.
Yes, Sergey, please.
Okay, thank you, Peter, for your presentation. Just have a rather tangential question that reflects my interest in the subject. If in the text that you are working, the authors, how often the question of freedom is discussed, if at all, in connection with demons? If do they have any chance to still exercise freedom? If they don't, what are the conditions? Is it ever discussed?
Thank you. It's a fascinating question, but actually it never comes up. So they never explicitly say that demons do have freedom. I think that one would find that in Greek authors, maybe coming from John of Damascus, or from that kind of direction. Of course, for them, angelic beings have freedom. And I mean, if they would conceive of demons as somehow related, I mean, only ontologically to angels, then they would probably also think that demons have freedom, but they do not talk about that.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So further questions, curiosities from the audience? So if not, I would ask her. Okay, Bishara, please.
No, go, Emiliano, if you. Okay.
Yes, please, Bishara.
Usually the link between freedom and will, and the freedom of the will, usually after the Christological controversies was linked to the Christological model. So anthropology was seen as in the light of Christology. Let's see it like that. Do we see any link from this notion in Abu Qurra's writings when he speaks about freedom and will, etc.? Usually, if he does not, I mean, if we have this, this background, but not very clear, because as you said, it was not written to Christians, but it was written to a Christian who was familiar with someone else. So maybe they will not talk about Christ or Christology, but can we see in the exposure of this topic some Christological links with this in this light?
Okay, yeah, thank you for this question. In this text on freedom, which is really the most extensive text on that topic, it's a kind of a monograph on the term Huria. He does not connect it to Christological debates, and as you already said, the reason behind that is, of course, that his opponents are not different Christological camps, but rather certain deterministic strands or currents of thought. But there is some kind of vague connection. I mean, there's this one letter by Theodore Abukura to a Mirfassite friend that he had called David, I think.
David, yes.
Yeah, where he does at least speak about human nature, and he does connect, so not human nature in Christ, but really human nature plain and simply, and he does connect it, however, to the Dürrfasite doctrine. And I think somewhere at the beginning of this letter, he says that the church fathers used this combination between the human body and the human soul as a simile to the way in which human and divine nature come together in Christ. And his point, however, is simply that this should not be taken at face value, but more as a kind of epistemological device to somehow deal with this very intricate theological and also logical question. So there's one connecting link, but in general, I mean, it's a bit, or I found it a bit frustrating, really, to look for what Theodore has to say about human nature in his writings, because when he speaks about human nature, it's normally, so all the statements that he makes are normally meant to serve a different argumentative purpose. So it's not really something that he wants to address theoretically, but he makes quite a lot of presuppositions in order to use familiar ideas or ideas that his opponents or his audience was probably familiar with in order to argue for something else. So that's what makes it a bit frustrating to really look for how he conceived of human nature.
Thank you. So there is a question in the chat from Claudia Simonelli. Did you find in other Christian Arabic sources, and if so, how often, the formula for defining freedom made through a periphrasis like the one you presented in Theodore Abukura? So can you read it in the chat?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So by formula for defining freedom, you mean using actually the word Jerutha, or using different terms but defining it in a similar way?
Claudia, do you want to speak?
Yes, I mean, for the formula, I mean, saying that freedom is something, you said, sorry. Yes, you say it is that freedom is called freedom. I thought about alone or a calque, and then define the definitions, followed by the definition. So I interpreted that like a formula. Maybe I found sometimes in other contexts for defining some concept. Maybe it's felt like distance in other cultural context. So the question is, the second term for freedom, is it a calque or loan, maybe through Syriac or through Greek?
Yeah.
And how often did you find it in other sources?
Yeah, I mean, there's a range of terms that stand where Theodore has freedom, but I think that his definition is really very peculiar, especially in the sense that he speaks of freedom in this kind of semi-allegorizing manner, as I said, that he attributes to freedom will, that he attributes this power of dominion to freedom. So it is actually freedom's dominion, it is freedom's will. This is very peculiar, and we don't find that, I think, in other authors. they have concepts like irada, which would be really the most common term used to speak about the will. They have this expression ikhtiyar, which means choice. Sometimes the expression qadar, which can mean both. So it basically means a power of determination, but it can mean both being determined, but also being self-determining. This is a notion that is employed, and there's another notion in this text that I already mentioned, the Summa Theologiae Arabica, which does oppose these two camps that we traditionally associate with this whole debate in the Muslim context. So the Qaddariya, which would normally be said to be the proponents of freedom, and the Jabriya, which would be said to be determinists. So the Summa has both these groups. The author actually calls them Ahl al-Qadr and Ahl al-Jabr. And then he ascribes to the first group an idea which he expresses with a also very interesting term, ihmal, which means something like being left loose. So they, and of course he does not approve of that notion. He says that the Ahl al-Qadr, they think that the human beings are somehow left loose, you know, like a flock, or like camels that are somehow unguarded and unobserved, and they can just do what they want. So that is also a peculiar notion that is used in that context. And in the same text, at some point, we also find the term sa'a, I think it is, which means like ample space to do things. So here we see that these authors maybe somehow also had problems or struggled to really find the exact Arabic terms to express what they wanted to say, be it you know, negatively. So some of them have kind of negative connotations, or positively. And I think that also Theodor Abukura's expression Huria was also a way to try to express what they wanted to say. But then I think really the Muslim discourse was just stronger, and became kind of the standard how to express these things, and that's why they started to use other terms, or to exclusively focus on certain terms.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have to draw near to conclusion, but if there are any other questions, I also have one, but I will ask at the end, just ask it at the end. So if there aren't further questions, I will ask this question. So you just mentioned determinism, well, already when discussing with Emmanuel, and now you mentioned the predestination again, and this makes me think that you actually isolated in this, and very brilliantly isolated, somewhat chemically, the concept of freedom. But and this is something that came up in the discussion with Emanuele. There is perhaps some use also in understanding it within the context of the debate on providence. So for Badaisen, the problem of freedom, I think, was most of all to be understood within the more general problem of providence, the wider problem of providence. And in a sense, this is also, with other names, the problem in the Muslim era. So you have a problem of determinism, of predestination, and I see, for example, that Western Syrians are writing between the 8th and the 9th centuries a row of works: Moses Bar Kifa, Anthony of Tigrid, Cyriacus of Tigrid, works on providence, within which they also define freedom. So it was the problem for Bardaisan in the 3rd century in defining freedom was providence in the background, and it is also providence again in the 9th. It appears to be providence in the 9th century. So perhaps there is a reason why this problem pops up again, also in Christian Arabic sources of the same period, perhaps really because the context, the general context, is that there is not a debate on freedom, on free will, with a term for free will, but there is a debate on determinism and predestination, which is probably the reason why they are all discussing freedom similarly to, but in completely another context in the 3rd century Bardaisan. So perhaps the problem in Theodore is not to get rid of the cosmological, the cosmogony of Bardaisan, but to respond to a similar problem. So I have talked too much already, but if you have any reaction, any thoughts on this, please.
Yeah, thanks. I think absolutely that this is a very important context, this notion of providence. And the problem of providence is, of course, a different version also of the problem of evil. So one question that all these authors that you've mentioned always have to deal with is how it is that there are certain kinds of injustice that we witness. So, for example, there are healthy people and there are ill people, there are wealthy people and there are poor people and so forth, that are very common run-of-the-mill examples that one would find in this discussions of providence, examples for ways to question actually divine providence. And I think that this is nothing that was really restricted to a Christian intellectual milieu, but we also already find it in late ancient times in Neoplatonic writings, that they somehow felt the need to deal with how divine providence works, and earlier also in Aristotelian philosophy. So, for example, Alexander of Aphrodisias' on providence, which only survives in Arabic, also became a very important text for Arabic authors, both Christian and Muslim, or even Jewish authors. So Moses Maimonides heavily draws on this text. And well, I think so. One important point is really how to deal with this problem of evil and how to relate evil to God and to human beings. And here, normally, human freedom is basically the idea that is it used to solve these issues. Then there are also complementary ideas like the educational purpose of suffering that comes in. And I think the Syrian authors that you mentioned, they of course stood in a tradition where these ideas about divine providence were really at the core of their theology or of their concept of God. And I think that they felt that they needed to give this a more clear characteristic in comparison to competing conceptions of God, and in Islamic times, of course, to competing conceptions of competing Muslim conceptions of God. And I mean, we know that there were these currents that somehow very gravely limited human power, human ability, human freedom in order to really highlight divine omnipotence. I think that it is not the case that there ever existed a school of theologians that actually thought that human beings are not free and incapable of performing their own actions, but it's really a conceptual and a logical question, how human power and human ability relate to divine power and divine ability. And yeah, I think that the Christian authors really needed to come up with a profile of this idea of divine providence that was somehow distinct from surrounding competing conceptions.
Thank you very much. And so if there are further notes, they are welcome. Otherwise, we are very pleased to thank Peter Tarras again for being with us today and for giving this very fascinating paper. So rich in suggestions and insights, and it was demonstrated by the long discussion. So I would like to thank you once again, and on behalf of the whole FLOS team also. And I would like to just to advertise the next FLOS lecture. It will be on the 7th of May, always at 10 in the morning. Our speaker will be Nadine Abbas from the University Saint Joseph of Beirut. She will talk in French, but an English version of the paper will be delivered through the chat. So the title will be Trinity in Yahya ibn Adi in his book on the refutation of Al-Warraq, the method, the concepts, and the doctrine. This is the English translation of the title, and Bishara Abeid will be the discussant to it. So thank you, Peter, once again, and see you all next time, hopefully.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Milano.
Thank you very much to you all for attending.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thanks for your comments. Thanks for being there.
And thank you very much for your paper once again. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, and thank you, Manuela, of course, for the discussion. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye.